Think for a moment. There is a type of person society has taught you to fear. You've heard about them in every podcast, every self-help article, every toxic relationship forum. The narcissist, the manipulator, the one who feels nothing and takes everything. You have been warned, diagnosed, and armed against them. But Carl Jung, the man who spent his life mapping the architecture of the human soul, was not watching the narcissist when he wrote his most unsettling warnings. He was watching someone else entirely. He was watching the empath reach the end of their rope. Think about this for a moment. The narcissist has always been broken. They entered the room already empty, already a predator. Their damage is legible. You can learn to recognize it. You can build walls against it. But what happens when the person who absorbed every blow, who gave without limit, who processed everyone else's pain like a machine, what happens when that person finally breaks? What happens when the most psychologically attuned human in the room decides to stop healing and starts remembering every single wound? Jung called it the awakening of the shadow, and he warned that this transformation, when it comes, is unlike anything the narcissist was ever capable of. You are here because you recognize yourself somewhere in that description. You gave too much for too long. You stayed in rooms that slowly drained you because you believed that your understanding could fix what was fundamentally broken. You absorbed anger that was never yours. You made yourself smaller so others could feel larger. And now something inside you is shifting, something you may not have a name for yet, something that feels like a new kind of cold clarity, anger without noise, detachment without apology. What you are feeling is not your destruction, it is your evolution. Today, we are going to go deep into Carl Jung's framework to understand exactly what happens when an empath integrates their shadow, why it is the most psychologically dangerous transformation a human being can undergo, why narcissists are entirely unprepared for it, and why society desperately wants you to believe this shift is something to be afraid of rather than something to be mastered. But I must warn you, what follows is not comfortable. Jung did not write comfortable truths. He wrote the ones that mattered. For your entire life, someone handed you an identity and called it a gift. You were the understanding one, the patient one, the one who could be trusted with the weight of other people's suffering. Teachers praised your emotional sensitivity. Partners leaned on your extraordinary capacity for empathy. Friends arrived at your door at midnight with problems that filled hours and left without once asking how you were. And you accepted all of it, not out of weakness, but because somewhere deep in your psychology, you had built an equation. The more I give, the more I belong. Jung called this the persona, the mask the psyche constructs to navigate social reality. It is not false in a deceptive sense, it is genuinely adaptive. The child who learns that gentleness earns safety builds a persona of gentleness. The adolescent who discovers that emotional availability earns love reinforces it. Over years, the persona becomes a fortress, not protecting you from the world, but protecting the world from seeing the parts of you that were never allowed to exist. And here is what Jung understood that nobody tells you. The persona is not your enemy, it was your survival. Every aspect of yourself that you suppressed, every impulse toward self-protection that felt too dangerous to express, every boundary you swallowed before it reached your lips, these did not disappear. They were not destroyed by your goodness. They were stored. Jung called that storage system the shadow. The shadow is not evil. This is the misunderstanding that costs people years of unnecessary suffering. The shadow is simply everything that consciousness refused to carry. For the empath, the shadow holds a specific and precise inventory. The anger that was inappropriate to express, the selfishness that would have cost connection, the capacity for indifference that would have seemed cruel, the strategic detachment that would have appeared cold. The empath's shadow is not a monster, it is a library, and it has been cataloging every wound with the accuracy of someone who was never allowed to respond in the moment. Ask yourself something now. When was the last time someone hurt you and you smiled through it? When was the last time you left a conversation carrying someone else's aggression and told yourself it was fine? How many times have you bitten down on a response that would have been honest, that would have been true, because the social cost felt too high? That moment of suppression is the shadow taking notes. And the narcissist who lives entirely in their surface performance, who has no shadow because they project it all outward, who has never once sat with their own discomfort long enough to understand it, the narcissist has no idea what is accumulating in the person they have been using as an emotional reservoir. They do not see the library, they only see the smile. This is why what comes next catches them completely off guard. Pause here and ask yourself honestly, have you started to feel something that used to scare you? A particular clarity, a kind of coldness that doesn't feel cruel but feels clean. Write that down in the comments. You may find you are not alone in recognizing it. Every person has a breaking point, but not every breaking point is the same. When an ordinary person reaches their limit, the eruption is emotional, scattered, reactive. They scream, they shut down, they retaliate with noise. The damage is real, but it is also short. The machinery of manipulation simply waits for the storm to pass and recalibrates. When an empath reaches their limit, something different happens, and Jung gave it a name that challenges everything: individuation. Individuation is not a breakdown, it is not a collapse, it is the process by which a human being becomes, for the first time, wholly themselves, integrating the parts of their psyche that the persona required them to suppress. For most people, individuation is a long, reluctant negotiation. For the empath who has been pushed past the threshold of tolerance, individuation arrives like a switch being thrown. And what emerges is someone who possesses everything that made them formidable: the emotional intelligence, the capacity to read people with extraordinary precision, the understanding of motivation and wound and mask, but has now paired that intelligence with the shadow material they spent a lifetime suppressing. The capacity for controlled indifference, the ability to feel nothing for someone who has repeatedly chosen to harm them, the strategic refusal to explain, justify, or defend, the complete withdrawal of the emotional currency that others had come to treat as their entitlement. This is why Jung warned that the fully individuated empath is not safer than a narcissist. In certain contexts, they are more dangerous, not because they become predatory, but because they become unreadable to those who relied on their predictability. Consider what the narcissist is designed to exploit. They need access to your emotional response. They require your investment, your hope that things will change, your belief that your love can fix something irreparable, your willingness to accept the blame for their instability. Every manipulation tactic, the guilt trip, the silent treatment, the intermittent reinforcement, functions only if you remain emotionally present, emotionally invested, emotionally reachable. The moment the empath integrates their shadow, the machinery stops. Because the shadow the empath has been storing does not contain cruelty, it contains something far more destabilizing to a narcissist's operating system: genuine indifference. The capacity to look at someone who once held enormous power over your nervous system and feel, measurably, verifiably, nothing worth protecting them from. No anger that could be weaponized back against you. No residual hope that could be cultivated into another cycle. No shame spiral that can be triggered by the right word. Just clarity. Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The empath who lives before individuation believes they keep ending up in these situations by accident, by the bad luck of choosing wrong, by some flaw in their judgment, by a generosity the world keeps punishing. They call it fate. After individuation, they look back at the pattern and see it with a precision that is almost surgical. They understand exactly how the mechanism worked, exactly which qualities of theirs were targeted, exactly when each manipulation began. And you cannot gaslight a person who has mapped every step of the process in retrospect. This is the moment where the narcissist's greatest weapon, the rewriting of history, the reframing of the victim's perceptions, becomes entirely useless. The empath does not need to argue about what happened. They have already finished that conversation in their own mind, without the other person present, without the interference of emotional noise, without the desperate need to be understood. They simply know. And knowing without needing to prove is a kind of sovereignty that no manipulation can touch. You are still here. I want to honor that. What follows is what most people never reach, the part that changes not just how you understand others, but how you operate from this point forward. Thank you for staying in the difficulty of this. What comes next is the part Jung spent decades trying to give the world. Understanding the transformation is not enough. You need the architecture of how to move through it without losing what makes you extraordinary. Because here is the trap that Jung himself identified as the most seductive danger of the individuation process: the temptation to overcorrect. When the shadow integrates, when all that suppressed material finally becomes available to the conscious self, there is an intoxicating sense of power in deploying it indiscriminately. The empath who discovers they can be cold may become colder than is useful. The one who discovers they can set boundaries may use those boundaries to wall out not just toxicity, but genuine connection. The one who discovers they can withdraw emotionally may mistake numbness for strength. This is what Jung called inflation, the psyche over-identifying with the newly integrated material, swinging from one extreme to the other. The fully individuated person does not become their shadow. They contain it. They carry it consciously, with full awareness of what it is capable of, and the discipline to deploy it when precision is required, rather than performance. Here is what the awakened empath architecture looks like in practice. The first element is selective empathy. This is perhaps the most radical reorientation, and the one that most requires the shadow's contribution. Empathy was never meant to be distributed without discernment. Jung's concept of the transcendent function describes the psyche's ability to hold opposites simultaneously: warmth and distance, care and indifference, engagement and withdrawal, without being destroyed by the tension between them. The awakened empath does not shut off their capacity for deep emotional attunement. They redirect it. They choose consciously which people have earned access to that depth. Everyone else receives a polite surface, functional, cordial, impenetrable. The second element is what Viktor Frankl, another thinker who understood suffering with extraordinary clarity, described as the space between stimulus and response. For the former empath in survival mode, that space was nearly non-existent. Someone delivered an emotional signal: pain, anger, disappointment, need, and the response was automatic, immediate, self-sacrificing. The awakened empath expands that space deliberately. They feel the stimulus, they observe it, they choose. This is not coldness, it is the opposite of coldness. It is the sophistication of someone who respects both the situation and themselves, enough not to react from reflex. The third element is the end of self-betrayal through over-explanation. Pay attention to this one. The empath has spent years justifying their choices to people who had already decided to misunderstand them, explaining their boundaries in the hope that a sufficiently articulate explanation would make the boundary acceptable, defending their perceptions against those who insisted on rewriting them. This behavior, deeply understandable, rooted in the genuine belief that enough clarity could bridge any gap, is one of the shadow's first casualties after integration, because the shadow carries the knowledge that certain people are not confused about your position. They simply want you to keep explaining so they can keep objecting. Silence deployed with clarity is not avoidance. It is a statement so complete it requires no translation. The fourth element is the restructuring of what gets your energy. Nietzsche, whom Jung read carefully and whose ideas about the will to self-overcoming deeply informed the individuation framework, understood that vitality is a finite resource that most people spend in entirely the wrong directions. The awakened empath looks at the previous allocation of their energy and recognizes the extent of the misallocation. Hours spent managing other people's emotional volatility, mental space occupied by trying to anticipate and prevent someone else's reactions, creative capacity drained by the emotional labor of being permanently available as a receptacle for suffering. That energy does not disappear when you reclaim it, it redirects, and for someone with the psychological depth of a genuine empath, the redirected energy becomes something that more primitive personalities cannot replicate because it is built from decades of understanding human motivation at a level most people never access. We arrive now at the insight Jung carried with the most urgency, the one he returned to across decades of writing, across case after case of individuals who had walked this path, and the one that contains the final and most important truth about what it means to awaken your shadow. The most dangerous version of you and the most complete version of you are the same person. Read that again, not because it is a comfortable thought, but because it is an exact one. Jung did not warn against shadow integration. He warned against shadow integration undertaken without consciousness. There is a crossroads the awakened empath reaches, and it arrives sooner than most people expect, often in the aftermath of the first major deployment of the newly integrated material. You went silent when you would have over-explained. You withdrew when you would have pursued. You refused to perform emotions you no longer felt, and it worked. The machinery of the old dynamic lost its grip. The person who relied on your predictability found themselves suddenly operating in empty air. Here is where the crossroads appears. One path leads toward what Jung called individuation in service of the self, the capitalized self, the totality of the psyche, the person you were actually built to become. This path uses the shadow's gifts, the capacity for strategic detachment, the indifference to social leverage, the refusal to be manipulated, in the project of becoming genuinely whole. The relationships that survive this transition are the ones that were always real. The work that emerges from this integration carries a depth and authority that was never possible when half of your psychological resources were locked in suppression. The person who arrives at the other end of this path is not harder, they are not colder, they are, for the first time, complete. And completion carries a particular kind of quiet that nothing can destabilize, because there is no longer a gap between what you feel and how you act, between who you are in private and who you are in the world. The other path, and this is the warning Jung felt most urgently, leads toward using the shadow not for integration, but for retribution, for the building of permanent walls, for the slow replacement of genuine feeling with the performance of invulnerability. The empath who chooses this path does not become a narcissist. They become something more specific and in some ways more tragic, a person of extraordinary psychological capacity who has permanently fused their armor to their skin, who confused protection with imprisonment, who decided in the aftermath of genuine damage that the safest version of themselves was the one that needed nothing and felt nothing and let nothing through. Jung was clear: the shadow cannot be wielded indefinitely without accountability to the whole person. It must be integrated, not weaponized. The difference between those two paths is not a matter of what you do externally. Both paths may look identical from the outside, the same silence, the same withdrawal, the same boundary. The difference lives entirely in the interior, in whether you are moving towards something or simply away from everything. The question the awakened empath must carry forward, the one that must be asked honestly and often, is not, "Can I remain unmoved?" That question has already been answered. You can. The shadow has given you that capacity. The question is, should I be moved by this? And that question requires not the shadow's intelligence alone, but the empath's original gift, the ability to perceive what is actually present in another person, to distinguish genuine appeal from manipulation, to know the difference between the person who has earned your opening and the one who is simply better at mimicking the signals. The narcissist never had that ability. They were born without the emotional architecture it requires. That is their tragedy, and it is not yours to solve. Your task is different. You have been given, through suffering you did not deserve, the rarest combination in human psychology, the depth to understand people at their most fundamental level, and the strength to choose precisely which of them deserve that understanding. Jung spent his life arguing that the fully individuated person is the most useful thing a human being can become, useful to themselves, to the people they genuinely love, to the world that is always desperate for consciousness in a sea of reflex. The narcissist was never a match for you. They succeeded only as long as your shadow was sleeping. It is awake now. The only question that remains, and it is the question I want you to sit with genuinely, not as a rhetorical device, but as a real inquiry, is this: what will you build with it? Not who will you defeat, what will you build? Because the shadow's energy, fully integrated, directed consciously, in service of the person you were built to become, that energy is not destructive, it is generative. It is the force that has been waiting underneath your entire story, locked in suppression, accumulating pressure, waiting for the moment you are ready to stop giving it to people who did not earn it and start giving it to the life you actually want. Jung wrote his most important work in the comfort of acceptance. He wrote it in the long confrontation with everything he had refused to see about himself. The descent into the shadow, for him, for the patients he worked with for decades, for the empaths who arrive at this crossroads, is not the end of the story. It is the end of the first chapter. What begins afterwards is the story that was always worth telling. Reflect on this in the comments, the moment something shifted in you, when the clarity arrived that felt different from anger, different from resignation, different from everything that came before. Tell me what that moment looked like. Your recognition matters more than you know. And if this opens something in you that you want to understand more deeply, subscribe, because what I can show you here is only what can be said in the open. There is more. There is always more. The ones who are ready will know what that means.